Very warm welcome from Amsterdam. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. We have a lot of registrations today, so I believe we are keying in from around the world. It's really a pleasure today to be able to moderate what's going to be a very interesting session between globally some very relevant players in the space of translational research, both from the social sciences and humanities side and the life sciences side. So based on a wildly interesting and successful workshop last year that brought those two worlds together to discuss the need for multidisciplinarity in translational research, we thought this webinar, and very kindly organized by Taylor and Francis, would be a fitting way to now continue the discussion on the challenges we face, to hear from research funders on the challenges they face and also the way they're solving issues in multidisciplinarity and translational research concept in general. So I'm not going to talk for too long because we have much more interesting people than myself, but I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. I'm Anton Ussi. I'm from EATRIS, ERIC, which is an international organization based in Europe, focused also on translational medicine, which is trying to take basic fundamental life sciences research findings and turning them into high value interventions for high unmet medical need, whether that's a diagnostic or a gene therapy or classical small molecule. It's our pleasure to have been doing this for quite a few years. We know the challenges and we also know the players here at the table. So it's going to be a real pleasure to talk to everybody here. Today we'll be talking with Alicia from CASE, which is the Campaign for Science and Engineering. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Anji Miller from LifeArc, who's a senior business partner there, and from Dr. Joni Rutter, the director at NIH NCATS, which is the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences based in the USA, sorry. And also we have Dr. Nikos Kastrinos, who's a former European Commission official, and is now also working as an advocate for the EASSH, which is the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities. And I see we have Gabby, who has also been able to join us. Gabby, that's great. Gabby Lobato is the executive director of EASSH. Great to have you there on board. So without much further ado, we're going to ask the speakers to give a few-minute overview of their take on translational research, how their organizations do it, the challenges we face. During the talks, please fire questions into the question box on your little control panel. We want to hear from you. After each talk, I'm going to take one question, and then after all talks are completed, we're going to have a bit of a discussion with the whole panel, and also include Gabby in that if she has time to stay with us. I know you're stuck in a meeting in Brussels, Gabby, which I saw you at yesterday. It was a pleasure. So, no further ado, let's go continue now. So, Alicia, if you would care to share with us your experience at CASE and also other organizations in the past, if that's relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anton, and thank you to everyone for joining. I'm so impressed at the number of people who have joined this, and I hope we get some good questions. So, as Anton said, I'm the executive director of something called CASE, which is the Campaign for Science and Engineering. I've only been doing this job for, it's not even 2 months yet, so I'm very new to the role. But our organisation is a charity, and we are the leading independent advocates for research and development in the UK. So we've got about 120 organisational members that are universities, businesses and research intensive charities. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my background so you understand where I'm coming from on the comments I'm going to make. So prior to this role, I was chief executive of something called KTN. We're an organisation that accelerated innovation, and our job was to connect companies to academia so that they could innovate better and more quickly. I've also worked as Director of Research and Enterprise in a university, but I spent many of my years working in the main UK research funders, so the main public funders of research and innovation in the UK, that are called the research councils. So I worked in different disciplines in engineering and arts and humanities, and I also moved out to India to set up the research council's relationship, the UK research council's relationship in R&D with India, and I was director of the similar organisation in China. So I spent 7 years developing those partnerships, and then I came back to the UK to set up a programme called the Newton Fund, which was around R&D, research and innovation partnerships with emerging economies across the world. So we worked with 15 different countries. So my comments are based on that experience. They'll be really general and they're very practical observations really from my experiences. So I'm just going to focus on two themes. The first theme is around people and communication, and the second theme is around money and funding. So on people, what I wanted to first bring attention to is whether we're talking about translation partnerships, whether it's between industry or society and academia, or whether it's international partnerships or even across disciplines. All of those partnerships and relationships are around people. And people, as we all know, they have different behaviours, they have different cultures. And for those to work, we need to communicate effectively. And I know for people in research, we often think of communication as a very soft topic. We love talking about policy, money, facilities, but none of those matter unless we have people and people that are working effectively together. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples. The first one is about when I was building partnerships, innovation and research partnerships between the UK and China. And what we used to do when we were developing those partnerships is we would start off very often with a workshop where we would bring together academics and businesses from the UK and China and talk about priorities. And what we found is the working styles were very, very different. And we had this problem that when we brought these different cultures together, very often the brainstorming and the free thinking didn't work very well. So what we'd have is the UK people having lots of ideas and being very vocal and taking over a bit. And sometimes the Chinese culture was more about talking to their colleagues and their boss to talk about their input. So the way we dealt with that is it took more time, but the way we dealt with that is prior to any workshop, we would meet separately with the UK delegation, we would meet separately with the Chinese delegation, whether it was business and academia. We would take time to do icebreakers with them and familiarise them with the approach we were going to use in the workshops. We would talk to them about how to engage. And that meant our interactions from then on went much better. And then the other example is really about bringing business and academia together in an international context. So when I was in India, we did some work around manufacturing, bringing together UK and India partners, academics and businesses on a joint innovation fund on manufacturing. And the problem with that, again, is we had people with very different backgrounds, very different experiences and ways of communicating, whether it was business or what country they came from. So we brought them together to get to know each other, but the way we got them to coalesce, to come together with ideas, was exposing them to a joint problem. So we would bring them, for example, to a manufacturing plant where there was an issue, or bring them to a company where they had a manufacturing process they wanted help with. And we brought those people together, whether they were academics from India or business from the UK, to build a shared purpose. And by physically introducing them and sharing with them a problem that they could work on together. So the other aspect, so I've talked a little bit about people and communication. The other thing is money, funding. And money, we all know money, I mean, that's incentivizes everything. It drives our behaviour, it helps us do things. So as a funder, what you do, what you fund, how you fund influences behaviours. And the funding models we use, whether it's international, whether it's about translation, business, academia, are really important. So I wanted to give a view from my experience in both India and China and setting up the international collaborations about international partnerships. My belief, and I'd be really happy to get feedback on this because some people don't agree with this, but is that true collaboration, in my view, requires both countries or each country to contribute and contribute money. It doesn't need to be the same amount, it doesn't need to be 50-50 equal, but both can contribute at the same time. And that drives a feeling of equity, of joint buy-in, and very often can bring your community in better. The problem if you don't do that is you can often, if you're leading with funding, it can seem a bit patronising, and very often your own community isn't brought in, your own R&D community isn't as invested if you're not putting money towards the activity. So the solution is both contributing, and then we end up in a much longer lasting relationship, a stronger relationship. So from a funder's point of view, to do that, you all need to be involved right from the beginning. So we need to be involved at the beginning to shape the funding mechanisms, to jointly bring in partners, to also review the proposals. So we need to meet early as funders, be prepared to negotiate and spend time on negotiating and building those relationships, but also really importantly to be flexible, because we love our own mechanisms and our own ways of doing things. And when you work with partners internationally or between business and academia, you need to be flexible. I was also just wanted to touch on with business and academia, I think many of us know this, but again, bring your businesses in and academics in early in helping shape the activities, particularly when there's processes or barriers involved. For example, managing IP, so that they're involved in that process and you're thinking early. Also, businesses, as we know, often don't have the time to deal with some of the processes that we use for funding in academia, so make sure you tailor it accordingly. And then the last section of this I wanted to touch on is reviewing. So reviewing where you want to spend money or your proposals, whether it's in translational research and innovation or whether it's in international work. How do you decide how to review and where you're going to invest? How do you decide what you're going to fund? It's really easy for us to think about this right at the end. And in my view, this is very often where delays happen because people haven't thought about this early enough. So think about this really early. How do you want to allocate money between partners? What process do you want to use? And make sure you have the framework in place. For example, if you want to do peer review, different countries have very different processes for doing that, and you need to be absolutely aligned on how you do that. And again, the same thing goes for IP agreements or any sort of process that you have to have in place for your business partners. Make sure you've talked about that early on. So I hope I haven't gone over time. Just in summary, I just wanted to recap and say, please remember and don't underestimate the value and importance of people, whether it's translational research, whether it's cross-country international partnerships or across disciplines. Remember the people and invest time on building those relationships. And also remember that money drives your partnership. So think about those objectives, be flexible and plan early, because collaboration is right at the heart of our R&D activities. So please invest time in it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Alicia, that was so much material, so much for us to work with there already. Thanks a lot. That was really, really great, great overview of the experiences you've had and so many learning points for us to take away there. So we'll definitely have a further discussion on those points you raised earlier on. I'm looking to see if we have any questions from the audience. We don't have anything yet. So one question I would ask to you would be, it's a people business, as you said, it really is. And everything you talked about was relating to how to bring people in a timely fashion. Would you say there are things you've learned that are just don't do's? Stay away from that. Never try it because it's a disaster waiting to happen. I know it's a tough question to put you on the spot, but anything you could share with us as a don't do?
Well, I think it's just the opposite of the do. It's don't be so wedded to your own way of doing things, because we all think the way that we do, well, maybe not, but most people think the way that they do things is the only way. Just don't be wedded to your way of things. It also gives you an opportunity to try other processes or other ways of bringing partners in, which can be a really important part of your own learning and your organization's learning as well. It's the opposite of all the do's.
Sounds good. Sounds very logical too. Much appreciated. Alicia, thank you so very much. I'm going to pass then the baton onto Anji, Dr. Anji Miller from LifeArc, based in the UK. Anji, you're going to give us a great overview, I think, of what LifeArc does, because there's a lot of amazing work there as well done already. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussions that are going to ensue. As you mentioned, I work for LifeArc. We are an independent healthcare charity. Everything that we do is in the translational space. So it's life sciences in the translational space. My background is advanced therapy. So I've been in the sector of technology transfer for the last 20 years, but I still work very close to the science and I still use my technical background. Our aim is getting really good academic research from the bench to impact society, so basically to the patient. We do this in multiple ways, but one of the main things is really to try and transverse that translational gap or the valley of death that we often hear about. And that's really where you have early translational research that struggles to really be developed and really turn into something that is a product or some sort of intervention that's going to impact society. So everything we do is really trying to push everything more towards the right end of this slide that you can see here. We have offices in Stevenage, where our wet labs are. We have diagnostics in Edinburgh, and our business function is in London, where I'm based. And how do we do it? So we have multiple capabilities, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because the thing is, I'd like to get into addressing the main topic for this panel shortly. But what we do is we work with academic derived technologies and those who invent them, and that's all sectors. And basically that could be working through collaboration, so translational science, using our expertise to help advise how best to translate that science into something impactful. We fund, and we don't fund where everyone else does. We look for gaps. So it's mainly in the rare disease space, but also something that I lead on a lot, and that's really upskilling, ensuring that those who do the research and those who can innovate have the appropriate skills. And this is on a global basis. So, you know, one of the questions was, for example, how can we help get translational research moving? There are two aspects that I'm going to focus on. The first is the funding model, the way we fund. And then the second is just talking about some of the initiatives involving upskilling, so the skills, ensuring those who are in the space, whether they're the researchers or the innovators, have the appropriate skills and resources to translate the research. As a funder, basically we encourage partnerships in funding, so shared risk, shared reward model. Because everything that we work in is translational research, a lot of the time this will be with a patient-led charity. The value and the support provided through this partnership is immeasurable. Basically, this will allow us to have that patient voice, which is really crucial to any intervention when it's being translated. It's not about the money. It's about what each partner can bring to the table. So that proximity to the patient, understanding really not how an intervention can impact society, but ensure that it impacts correctly. So it is the right treatment for this patient group. It is applicable, it is practical, and it really does, it's something that really can be translated and used in a shorter time than if you have great technology that really is not applied to the patient group. Here, I've just got a slide just talking about one of the projects that's in my portfolio. This is in partnership with the Aplastic Anemia Trust. And this is for a clinical trial that we are supporting with the AAT. And basically, this will ensure that patient group that really would not receive any sort of intervention or the promise of a treatment really has hope through this partnership. The next aspect that I'd just like to dwell on is really skills. And the next two slides are just going to cover this. So as I mentioned before, it's great having translational science and technologies, but the thing is, you need to get them from the bench to the patient, get them impacting society in a positive way. The individuals who do that need to have a mix of skills. So it's science, business, law. We have to ensure that basically, not only do we have great researchers, but we have those who can support it and the infrastructure to ensure that happens. One of the things that LifeArc does is really with the innovation sector, we have 2 fellowship programs, and these are for those with STEM backgrounds who really want to have the appropriate skills to help drive innovation forward. So you work closely with the researchers, you work closely with industry, you also work closely with the charity sector. You need to understand what the needs are, you need to understand the funding landscape, but also really what the assets are. This is just really outlining two of the programs that we have. This has been going on for over 80 years and it's very impactful. But it means that not only can we fund these technologies, but we can support those that we fund, the projects that we manage, but also when we collaborate with others. And this is on a global scale. The last slide that I'll really address is really looking at how we can help, again, upskill those in the sector globally. So two of the initiatives that we have and that I'm involved in is really one with the Malawi Liverpool Welcome Innovation. Basically, it's an Innovation Week that they had, but with the Malawi Liverpool Welcome program, that really helps to ensure that technologies within Malawi are developed and are pushed forward, just the same as LifeArc does globally on overall. But with this program, this is in partnership with the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and supported by the Wellcome Trust. The next is the CRIC Africa Network, and with the CRIC Institute in London, this is ensuring that researchers who provide really are working to really develop their groups, they not only have great science, but their science is appropriate for the needs of society. So the modern scientist not only needs to be able to have the tools to work at the bench, but they also need to know how they can get the outputs from their research to impact society. And that's working with innovation professionals like myself and like the fellows that we have in the following slide. There are many challenges for translating research, and these are just two that I've just tapped on. I won't go any further because I think what I'd like to see is some of the questions, and I can't wait to get into the discussion where we can delve deeper into this topic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anji. Very nice to see the amazing work that LifeArc does both in Europe, the UK, but also further afield in countries that are definitely in need of the collaborative and cooperative support. Alicia, not yet. We know you're very excited. Anji, one question that I have for you is the upskilling is such an important thing. Would you say that if somebody is interested in developing their skills towards translation or becoming a translational scientist, is there a character type, or are there skills that you think this person really needs to be this or that, or there are some skills that really come to the fore?
As a researcher, I think it's understanding the stages required. So why some of the asks that are being put forward when you have your research, the questions that are being asked, I think it's understanding why those are taking place. It makes it much easier for an innovation professional to actually do that. So I think it's really that level of trust that you need to have with the equivalent of your technology transfer office. I think that's essential. But I think it's also understanding really how can you impact society. It's not just the view that you have as a scientist. It could be a lot broader. And how you impact, for example, in say sub-Saharan Africa is going to be very different to say Europe or the US. I think communication is key. As an innovation professional, I think you need to have vision, but I think overall you need to have passion, and it's really passion to ensure that really this is going to impact society. It's not going to be just that publication that's going to take place. You're going to go further and beyond that.
Very nice. Thanks a lot, Anji. A real inspiring call to arms there. So become an innovation professional. Super. Thank you. Okay. Anji, thanks a lot. We're going to now move on then to the next speaker, who's Dr. Joni Rutter, who's the director at NCATS based in the USA. Joni, thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to your talk. Please go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Anton. I'm seeing the presenter view. Can you see the presenter view okay?
We see the presenter view, but it's big enough, I think. So if you can't change it, don't worry about it.
Okay, maybe I can try this. Did that work?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay.
What you had before, yeah. It's gone now to the 2-slide thing, but I think just keep it there. It's totally fine.
Okay. How about that? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully this will work okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. My name is Joni Rutter from the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. We are amongst 27 different institutes and centers within the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And our goal within the NCATS organization is really very similar to what our previous presenter mentioned before. It's really moving things from the bench to the bedside, and we fund research that is really meant to support this. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do here at NCATS. Our main mission is to turn research observations into health solutions through translational science. And this really involves a variety of approaches, basically developing different methods from the preclinical research space and the clinical research space, moving them into public health, and demonstrating their usefulness and then disseminating those findings. And so those are key activities. We have three main audacious goals that we're trying to meet through NCATS. With our mission, we want to bring more treatments for all people more quickly. And these sound very big goals, and they are. But essentially, the reason we have them is because of many of the challenges that we have in the translational science space. And so I want to talk through sort of how we might think about moving the ability of bringing more treatments for all people more quickly. And I think I want to give you some of the key aspects around this. Now, what this really focuses on, and I'm really glad the two speakers before me really talked about the people who are involved, but that's essentially so critical to the activities that we do. And in fact, working with EATRIS and something called Translation Together, we've generated a variety of things that create characteristics of what a translational scientist is. And those activities then actually translated into some key themes or principles that we use here at NCATS to help drive and support the research that we do. So in thinking about more treatments, we understand that we really need to build generalizable solutions using creativity and innovation, and bringing that to all people. This was really about generating the support for team science, thinking about what research isn't really supporting or funding, so focusing on those unmet needs, and then focusing also on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then more quickly, really thinking about the efficiency and speed and developing those boundary crossing partnerships to be really bold and rigorous in the approaches that we do. And this was really, it stemmed from a publication that we did with EATRIS and Translation Together. So I wanted to highlight this publication here. And highlight where these sorts of principles really came from. So this was work that really was a partnership with this group. Now, in terms of what NCATS really does, we don't really focus on any of the basic sciences. We focus really on the preclinical and clinical translational efforts that are needed. And the main issues here are that within the pipeline of translation that we kind of talk about quite a bit, there are crimps in that pipeline that slow our ability down to move things from the bench to the bedside. And so our main goals are to identify what those crimps are, where those bottlenecks are, and start to attack those so that we can make those, the ideas of the projects that we support through translational science move through the pipeline much better and faster. So how do we do that? We have four key approaches. One is to understand what's similar across different diseases to spur multiple treatments at a time. We also want to think about how we can develop models that better predict a person's reaction to therapeutics or other types of treatment modalities. We want to enhance clinical trials so that the results more accurately reflect the patient population. And we also want to leverage real-world data and data science approaches to address these public health needs. And this is critical because there are over 10,000 rare diseases, and only 5% of those rare diseases have treatments. And so in that more treatments audacious goal, we want to move from 5% of treatments to 25% of treatments. And that's not always so straightforward. And so we've been at that 5% space for a very long time, and we really need to move the needle in some ways. The issue with that, though, is that it takes 10 to 15 years to get a molecule to clinical trials, and another 10 years to really move the molecules from clinical trials to the medicine cabinets. So there's a lot happening in this space, and so the critical aspects of really understanding how we can address these bottlenecks is important. It's not just the scientific bottlenecks; it's these operational challenges too. If I didn't say so already, the cost of moving things through the pipeline in terms of drug development is at a price tag of $2.6 million US dollars on average. So that's quite a hefty price tag. And in addition to that, 90% of the time, this process fails. And it fails in the later stage of that clinical development, in generally phase 2 and phase 3 of clinical trials, in that safety and efficacy phase. So here's where we really need to address these bottlenecks in the pipeline. And so I'm going to give you some vignettes on some of these bottlenecks, and they're shown here essentially in one of the ways in which we want to develop these better predictive models. I'll talk a little bit about gene therapies, and then I'll end up on some data science activities and drug repurposing. So one of these key activities that we want to support is that in order to raise all boats for therapeutic development, and we don't really focus on any one given disease or organ system, we focus on all of them. And so our goals are to develop platform-based approaches that can help raise all of these boats, and that really helps us think about things in a disease-agnostic way, but it also helps us think about it in a more than one disease at a time fashion. If we have over 10,000 rare diseases and go one disease at a time, it will take us thousands of years before we're able to have therapies that can be effective for many of them. So we really want to think about that efficiency and speed aspect in being able to move the needle. So building better predictive models is what we're thinking about. Rodents and 2D cell culture models have not really served us well in the past. They've done certain aspects very well, but we need to figure out ways to do it better. So now we're thinking about the newer technology and bringing in patient cells, blood from patients, changing them into induced pluripotent stem cells, and then de-differentiating them or redifferentiating them into target cells and systems. And we can create tissues on chips or 3D bioprinted chips as well. And you can imagine then ultimately that you can create a precision medicine, or you on a chip, if you will. So taking cells from you to look at a particular disease condition that you might have, but before we give you a therapeutic medication to be tested in a clinical trial, we can perhaps do something on a chip where it's not going into your system just yet. And so in this way, we're about building of approaches to create vision that develop therapeutics diseases. And essentially doing the other thing is for myasthenics, we're taking cells, particularly with diseases, creating IPS, and looking at it as gene therapy, this syndrome. And gene therapy created, we want to see if it would restore the contractile motion of the neuromuscular junction. And this is the image that you're seeing there. We're seeing a restorage of that contractility. And so this is the kind of approach that we can do with these predictive models. Now, I've talked a little bit about these gene therapies. So I'm hoping, oops, it looks like it's paused for some reason. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show it. But
yeah, Joni, we still hear you, but I think your laptop may have been trembling a bit. Yeah.
Yes. So apologies for that, but essentially what we're able to do is gene therapy approaches. We're thinking about somatic cell gene editing, gene therapy. But again, here our approach is not to take it at a one disease at a time way. We're looking at it, the ability to look at delivery in and of itself. So delivering the way that we can deliver the restorative therapies into people using adeno-associated viral vectors, for example. This is one approach that we're able to think about that delivery model. And so through somatic cell gene editing and gene therapy, these are the kinds of approaches that we're using, but not focusing again on the disease, really focusing on the delivery method and how we can get those deliveries to particular cells. We have a variety of programs in this space, and we've also created a playbook as well through something called the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium that we have on our website. I'm happy to put some of these links in the chat. And so with that, I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joni. Much appreciated. I like how you described the process of translation being high in failure, especially in life sciences. It's extremely high risk, and it's not only down to the science, but the system itself, with all these different players and different priorities and different reward systems that don't necessarily point in the same direction, makes it very challenging. And I think that's something that we should definitely come to a bit later on. But would you say that there is any specific single factor that's the biggest reason for failure besides the scientific failure? What would you say if you had to fix one thing in the systemic risk? What would it be that you would approach?
Okay, so you said I can't talk about science, but one of the key things in science.
That risk is always there, right? How do we make the system better?
Yeah. Yes. Really, it is that efficacy that's very difficult on the scientific side. So thinking about how we can build these better models, that's one. But from the other perspective, on the operational side, perhaps, I think there are two things. One is building the next generation to really be thinking differently and how to approach clinical and translational science. Really thinking about these sort of out-of-the-box ideas, more innovative clinical trials, to think about that efficacy from the very beginning. So that's one. The second answer I would give is much of this is essentially built around contracting and working with CROs and really an ecosystem of people working together across different sectors. I think paving the way for allowing more seamless interactions across sectors to address our ability to move things through the pipeline, developing better models that can streamline those contract developments, for example, would be really, really helpful. So these are some of the things that really slow us down.
Brilliant, great, super, great food for thought. Thank you. So really about helping the next generation have that mindset of application as well, not just discovery. I like that a lot, and how to work across boundaries, whether that's institutional or sectoral. Thank you. Right, okay, so we're going to move on to the last speaker of the day. Joni, thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Nikos Kastrinos to the screen, if you may. So Nikos is a former European Commission official who was very heavily involved in the Foresight strategy for previous framework programs, and now is an advocate for the EASSH Alliance. Please go ahead, Nikos.
Thank you very much. I don't see my presentation. I wonder whether anybody else sees my presentation.
We do see it perfectly, yeah. Global collaborations in translational research.
Excellent. So, hi, I'm Nikos Kastrinos, a recently retired EU official and a long-term friend of the European Alliance for the Social Sciences and Humanities, on behalf of which I have the pleasure of speaking in this webinar. And my idea is to give you a view of global collaborations in translational research from the perspectives of the social sciences and the humanities. And by that, I don't mean that all sociologists and all art historians would agree with me, but rather that my view is shaped by my efforts to advance the interests of social sciences and humanities in the EU, including those of supporting EASSH. For those who don't know the European Alliance for the Social Sciences and the Humanities, it is an advocacy and science policy organization that aims at promoting the social sciences and humanities in Europe in the spheres of European policy, but also to advance research in the social sciences and the humanities as a resource for the world. It's a membership organization. There are more than 70 member organizations. I suspect there may even be more than 71, but I don't know the exact number yet, representing a wide range of disciplinary areas, stakeholders and universities from across Europe. For those of you who are not into the social sciences and humanities, I need to start by saying that both global cooperation and translation are quite challenging for our fields, even though translation is a term that came out of sociology. Part of the reasons have to do with the nature of social sciences and humanities knowledge. They are more reflexive in a way there is no such thing as objective observation. The observer is always part of what's happening. And so it is very difficult to distinguish between the contingent phenomena and the general phenomenon. And there are important discussions and debates about what is the model and what's the application. And the social sciences started at some point in time as part of moral philosophy, as part of a question of what is the right thing to do, what is the way one should live one's life. But they have become increasingly distant from this, and this makes translation difficult because you are never sure whether your good is the good of everybody else. Partly as a result of that, large-scale collaborative projects are rare, especially in the humanities. Part of the whole contingency discussion is the question of language, for example. What language do I communicate with? And this is not something in which our disciplines are, large-scale collaborations are not things in which our disciplines are very good at. In effect, about 20 years ago, I organized a session in a AAAS in San Francisco on whether there is a single question that can be understood the same across the world, and it was a big debate at the time, and I suspect it would be a big debate now. So the idea of global cooperation is something that we find challenging, and the translation is something that we find challenging. At the same time, there are important connections between the social sciences and humanities and translational research. In a way, social sciences and humanities are an important part of the health sciences. Public health, occupational health, mental health, and all sorts of health are issues in which a great deal of social scientists and humanities researchers address. And there are also some important research traditions that have commonalities. Action research and social innovation are things that come to my mind, but I'm sure there's more. And in both cases, in translational research and the health sciences and in the social sciences and humanities, there is the context that is important, and engagement with people and society are important. I can also see some shared organizational challenges. In both cases, investors are needed, and by that I don't mean only that money is needed, but you need also the money and the people who have an interest in doing something with the results of the work. As we heard from previous speakers, investing in translation is investing in innovation, and innovation for good and without profit is an important challenge. And there are roles in covering this space for all sorts of public policy funders, national and international, NGOs and the philanthropists. And I have put on my slide a couple of pictures. One is from the European Research Council that has a proof of concept grant that aims exactly at taking interesting concepts out of the lab and into the world. And even the big bastion of basic research in Europe, the Max Planck Society, have their own technology transfer office. Very often in the circles I used to frequent, the question is asked, what is the role of the social sciences and the humanities in the innovation system? And similarly, amongst all the technology transfer conversation, I'm sure that there are questions of what is the role of translational research in an innovation system. And there are many people who are cracking their heads to figure out how they are best organized. And these are very good and valuable questions, but their framing is a bit challenging, and I would say be careful what you wish for. I would have been much happier if the question was, what are the 10 most important roles that translational research plays in an innovation system, and what are the 15 best ways in which they can be organized, for example. Now, from the perspective of the social sciences and the humanities, but also I think from the perspective of the translational research, there are good reasons why we need to strengthen the connections between the two. One is the increasing demand for the social sciences and humanities to have an impact. There are more and more the people, the funders, expect new ways to valorize knowledge, data archives and collections, to support processes of change, an example, sustainable economic development, to improve the human condition, peace and prosperity, and so on and so forth. In fact, there has been over the last probably 25 years a drive for evidence-based policy, which is about exploiting and valorizing social sciences and humanities knowledge. There is a recognition that policy often moves from theory to practice without careful reflection on evidence, and there is a lot of innovations about how to improve the policy-making process, living labs, sandboxes, policy experiments, and so on. But efforts are still rudimentary, and quality of evidence and quality of deliberation are important challenges for policymaking. There are also some emerging conundrums in the translational space, which I think make good reasons to strengthen the connections. Things that appear to me are about the increasing importance and understanding of contingency in biological phenomena. And here before me, Joni Rutter spoke about you on a chip as opposed to human on a chip, and so on. So what is modeled and what is very specific is something that is an issue in biological sciences, and it is recognized as important. There are some important changes in public attitudes towards research methods, and here I'm thinking about, especially about the sentiment towards using animals as models for health research. Again, Joni Rutter's presentation was very, very relevant. There are emerging concerns with planetary health, which creates some kind of conflict between human health and the health of other things in the planet, and that this could become very specific, your health versus the health of the cats that live nearby. And there are important another emerging conundrum that I see is about the use of artificial intelligence in translation, especially since the translation has this strong value-driven element of innovation for good. Now, what do I expect for the future in this field? Well, one thing that I expect is more explicit concern with translation in the emerging conundrum areas. I expect to see programs on translation and artificial intelligence, on translational research for planetary health, contingency in translational research, and public engagement and participation in translational research and practice. I expect more scholars from the social sciences and humanities to be involved in translational research programs in the context of interdisciplinary project and project teams. But I also expect to see more specialist programs. When I started in this field, there were some programs on information technology that involved at the side social sciences for information technology. And a great deal of what we know about the way in which information technology affects organizations comes from those research programs, and they have been very important in the developing technology field, and I expect that they would have things to contribute in the practice of translational research. But I also expect to see more demand for responsible research and innovation shaping the regulatory context of translational research. In a way, in the translational research field, there is a desire to do away with regulation. The regulation is seen as something that slows things down. And I am quite careful about this. I think that regulation is important. It's important to regulate well. But I think that starting with a theory that has promise may be seen as the nightingale in the forest, but it could well be the canary in the mine, because it's not only the idea, but it's also what you do with it that matters. And I have put there a picture about Monsanto's genetically modified seeds from an article on Monsanto's genetically modified seeds that were pesticide resistant and can have very deleterious environmental effects by virtue of the method in which they're used, which involves killing everything else and allowing them to survive. This is what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention. The website of EASSH is there, and my personal blog is the openconspiracy.blog. Thank you.
Wonderful, Nikos, thanks very much. Very interesting foresights you had there, also showing the increasing relevance of the social sciences in terms of formulating policy for these quite scary but also hugely opportune-filled technology developments like AI. Would you say that your foresight there, the one was that you foresee more SSH researchers getting involved in translation? Is that a top-down initiative where there's pressure to do so, or is that a bottom-up initiative where there's more potential application of their open science?
Okay, this was me being a lobbyist for the social sciences and humanities. In fact, what happens to people like me who have had interdisciplinary careers, and like you, I suspect, Anton, is that what we studied doesn't matter very much after a while. And so I would have a great deal of difficulty in translating it into statistics and specific targets. In the history of research policy, there have been very successful and good research programs that were about promoting collaboration between different disciplines. And they were asking explicitly for, one I'm thinking about is an American one, it was called the KDI, the Knowledge Development Initiative. It was from the late 90s. It was from my more involved, like the period when I was involved in research. And where there the idea was to bring information technology specialists and social scientists together in proposals. And the emphasis was not very much on the outcome, but was on the process. And there were a great deal of important insights developed in a number of fields through that program. So I think that in a way, setting it as a target in program to promote interdisciplinary cooperation actually is a good thing and helps. And I expect that people in the funding agencies will see this and will adopt this approach. This is what I meant, not about specific targets.
Yeah, understand. Brilliant, Nikos, thank you very much. If I could ask you to stop sharing your slides and ask all the other speakers now, please, to put on your cameras, and we can move now into the panel session. I have a couple of questions from online that I think are very interesting. One that I think is definitely for all the panelists is how could publishers best support the reporting of translational researchers? So where do you see the publishing industry's role in engendering good translational science practices? Anybody who raises a hand? Otherwise, I'm going to start pointing fingers. Okay, go ahead, Joni, please, and then Nikos.
Okay, thank you. It's a really great question. Publishers play such an important role in translational science, well, in all science really. But you know, what we find is that there's a lot of bias in what gets published because we tend to publish positive findings or things that we think tend to, you know, answer the question that we have asked. And importantly, I'll just give you an anecdote. For example, there was a clinical trial that was conducted recently to just look at comparing a method. Does method A work for a surgical intervention, or does method B work for a surgical intervention? And it turns out that this group published the finding, and the finding was neutral. There was no difference between surgical method A and surgical method B. And what was fascinating about this was that she received many emails from colleagues saying, I have done that exact clinical trial, but I didn't publish it because it wasn't positive. And so the importance here is that we're actually wasting money and resources because we're not publishing what we need to publish. And so what we really need is the publishing community to be able to recognize this as a challenge, as a translational science problem, and start to address how we can really encourage more publications like this. Now, maybe there are ways to do this in a sort of med-archive or bioarchive kind of way, and that's certainly possible. But the other key aspect that we're working on at NCATS is something that we've coined LitCoin, which is essentially any particular activity or part of an experiment that you may not ever see yourself publishing in a real paper, but is important to get disseminated to the community. We want to work with publishers to be able to generate what this might look like. And the goal in partly doing this is to build the repertoire of the ability of machine learning, perhaps, to be a part of how we can search particular activities. And so if we can make what we're talking about in this LitCoin kind of space, those small publishable units that could be machine readable, then allow us to find those in the literature much better. And so those are the kinds of pathways that we're trying to work with publishers on to address these sorts of challenges.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think there's going to be a point quite soon in the future where the AI will be able to do a lot of the dog work, but that means publishers and research funders need to be ensuring that research, including those negative results, are actually then findable and accessible and are usable. So this verification process is very interesting. I see that Alicia has a hand up, but I'm going to point to Nikos first, who had his hand up, and then to Alicia. And Gabby, welcome. Please stay with us for the remainder if you can. We definitely will come to you in a sec. So Nikos.
Okay, well, not very much to add. I think it's extremely important to get publishers involved more with the promotion of the smaller findings and the pieces of knowledge that remain localized and so on. I also think that it is important to get into inspiring people. So I read less science these days and more almost science, stories, blogs and things like that. And I think that there's a lot of inspiring people that can happen through this sort of thing. So I also want publishers to kind of develop less dry sort of science and more storytelling lines around science and research and so on. So this is what I was going to say.
That's a very nice point. Really, it's a very true indeed. I think we need to get that narrative voice back, I think, in order to be able to inspire, especially the younger generation, where I think it's proving ever more challenging with so many competing channels with which to reach people. Alicia, please share.
Yeah, well, I mean, my point is very similar to Nikos's one, and I thought Joni's one's really good as well. So it's such an interesting question, because it comes to the question is, what's the role of publishing? So I've been working in the R&D context of funding and strategy and stuff for years, and I read very few academic papers now, but I'm super interested in what's happening in R&D. So I think there's a whole question about the role of publishers. The same point that Nikos is saying, how do we get information out to who, by the way, because obviously you've got the academic community, you've got the business community, you've got the much wider community of interested people, and the public, by the way, that we don't talk about very much. But the other point related to that is incentives for people to publish. So I'm not as clear in other countries, but in the UK, there's very, very strong incentives for academics to publish a lot in certain places and almost get scored on that. And I'm sure that's the same in other countries. So I think there's a whole thing when we talk about translational research or any type of research that doesn't fall in your traditional sort of hardcore research is how do we incentivize telling people about that? And how do we incentivize translating that into a wider audience? And whatever we mean by translation, how do we get that out? So I think we need to just question almost the whole system. Even though we're focusing on the publisher, it's a wider question about getting messages out.
Yeah, very good point indeed. Translation tends to be confirmatory science, which is a little bit boring and unsexy relative to the new discoveries that you might end up in a Nature publication or other such high impact journals. And I think the reward system hasn't yet caught up. There's a lot of effort to try and broaden the reward system, but it still seems to be that high impact publication factors is what's driving careers right now, unless you have examples of where you're seeing it being done differently now. Does anybody have examples of where you see organizations or regions that are really working constructively towards also rewarding collaborative research and more innovation focused activities as a balanced part, a balanced scorecard of career progression? Any examples? Yeah, please, Gabby.
Hi, I'm Gabby Lombardo. I'm the director of the European Alliance of Social Sciences and Humanities. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have some sense that this is going to change in the future as part of the COARA development, the reform of research evaluation movement, at least the European level of a 500 organizations subscribing for the sense that the research should be rewarded in different ways, and researchers should be rewarded in different ways, and projects should be communicated much wider. And so the assessment of research evaluation, not just done on the ranking system, on the numbers of the ranking system, the high impact factors, but rather on the influence and then this research can determine. So we're not quite there yet, but at least there is a sense of movement in that direction, which I think is particularly important. To go back to the publisher, this is a really important role they play, because in some sort of ways, whereas the researchers is very often curiosity driven, and particularly for our set of disciplines, you do have a sense of what you want to do, you want to achieve in your research, but maybe your audience is the one you haven't actually looked at. Translational research is typically within medicine, where you have almost a kind of a linear, I like some of the slides are showing, from the clinical trial to the patient, you got a target, you know exactly who you're aiming for. But when you do sociology, actually you aim society in this whole variety of perspectives. It's not like a simple target. You don't have a big red square at the center of a circle and you know where to get to. And maybe if I'm studying something around economic history and I'm particularly interested in a certain community, I might have an impact on a completely different. And so it's just, for certain disciplines, the translational research is not as linear as it seems to be. So the role of publisher in that sense is also to convey the research that matter to the community for which this research matter. And as the third layer of the discussion that I would like to address is a reward system also in terms of feeding back on public policy or policy makers. There's a lot of discussion at the moment how science should be better at inform policy makers. And, if you're a doctor, and we saw with COVID, it was really interesting. The doctor is saying, yeah, we're doing vaccine and we cure everything, and immediately get listened to by the policymakers. Whereas the sociologist said, actually, if people are sick, they really should be isolated. We need to find a way to keep them apart. That wasn't very welcome. And even within the discipline, we have that kind of sense. It was a kind of a quote of one of the chief medical advisor in UK saying, oh, we really appreciated the contribution of social scientists in the COVID crisis, as long as they don't talk within us in the same room. As long as we keep these things separate. So it's not a straightforward matter being translational and apply, and even inspiring people in doing it, particularly in some disciplines. There's such high level liability where researchers said, I advise, I don't make decision. But if you're a political scientist, the line has become a bit blurred. Thank you.
I think trust is a very important factor brought up there, on both sides. I mean, we also have on the life sciences field a lot of skepticism around the science, and I think that's something that we as a society, it's a systemic issue that we need to address. Not sure we can answer it today, so I'm not going to reach for that electric pole. But I have a question for Joni in a related space, which is when the translational process was super accelerated because of COVID, and obviously huge amounts of resources were poured into the development process. That resulted in some mistrust also, where like, wait, okay, maybe this is too fast. Is that actually safe? So how How do we ensure that how could we find that balance of showing it's done quickly, but also rigorously and robustly with safety at hand? Is there a lesson we can learn from the COVID experience?
Oh, I think there are many lessons we can learn from the COVID experience, and that is definitely one of them. I think we really missed the mark on sort of communicating science here during this time. We were so focused on speed and not focused necessarily on people. And that came through very loud and clear very early on. We were not well coordinated, so I think we now recognize that was a very large challenge. So I think one of the lessons learned from COVID, though, is, first of all, the message is that it actually wasn't fast. We had been generating the mRNA technology for many years, a decade prior to when the pandemic hit. And so the technology was there and it could be applied relatively quickly, but not because it was done in a quick way, but because the science was already there to support it. And where we missed our opportunity is to talk about that as a narrative. We have been working on this for many years, and the science is there to support it. It's safe and effective. I think the second piece of the issue with the vaccines very specifically is the vaccines were very effective in preventing severe disease, but they weren't effective in stopping you from acquiring COVID. And that's a very different message. It's a nuanced message. And we didn't take enough time to build the narrative and the messaging around that to the communities that really needed to hear them. So I think those two pieces were really part of almost like a perfect storm, where then we come in and we need to do clinical trials for the vaccines, and we go to communities without really talking about this as a sort of bringing them into the design of the studies and talking with the communities about them and bringing in the humanitarian components and the social components to that because of the urgency needed. And I think that what we really needed, and Nikos, I think, is really highlighted this, is we really needed the social scientists as part of the teams to help us think about how to design that piece of the communication. And I think so one of the lessons learned, I think, is if we have a pandemic that happens again in our lifetimes, we really need to build that in from the very beginning. And by the very beginning, I think now is the time to do that. When we're thinking about the studies that we're doing in other areas, not related to pandemics or COVID, but related to other diseases and the kinds of therapeutics we're building, it's about co-designing and bringing in the communities, bringing in the patients, the patient advocacy groups, to not just be at the table. We want them to be at the table, but they should be supported equally to help co-design and provide that input needed to provide that sort of scientific and social aspect of what we need to do. So I think those are some of the aspects that I would think about as lessons learned.
Thanks, Joni, indeed. And it's an opportunity now also when advocating for the continuation of funding of very basic science. It was by virtue of that funding that our understanding of the coronavirus has made that acceleration. That's a tool we should be using now and shouting it from the rooftops. Look, we saved how many millions of lives by being able to cut down the development time. Alicia, I think you may have a comment. I think it
was a really minor comment. Excuse me. It was just something you said, Anton, a few minutes ago. Excuse me, when you described sort of fundamental research, when we were talking about publishing, we were talking about fundamental research being sexy and translational research being, I don't think you used this word, but essentially boring. I think that's what we need to turn on its head. So I think academia can be quite snobby, right? So we think all these really clever ideas nobody really understands, so they're really special. Isn't it amazing being able to bring an idea and make it useful to the world, right? Or useful to business or useful to society. So I think it's almost coming away from that snobbery of academia and saying, taking an idea and making it useful is where the power is. So I think that relates back to the publishing. It's about us changing the narrative a bit, and just the general way we speak about research and its and innovation and its value.
Yeah, it's a great point. And also, I mean, introducing them to the beneficiaries of their work. So when we introduce basic scientists to patients, it's transformational in their mindsets and their thinking, and it really does. These are really cathartic moments for them. I think it's so important for biomedical researchers specifically to understand that. Anji, I'm going to come to you in a moment to ask about your experience there in terms of engaging academics. What are the do's and don'ts? Are there specific phenotypes in the academics that you say stay away from them, or these are great collaborators? But first, I'd like to go quickly back to Gabby and to Nikos, asking, is there something equivalent that you can galvanize or energize social science and humanities research by saying, talk to these people, see the impact of your work, focus on making your work impactful as well as interesting academically?
One hopes that there is. So local development and local governance are actually areas that are put forward. At the same time, for the social scientists, this is a very, very, very difficult issue. Many years ago, I organized a meeting on useful social science, and I had Ron Harre from Oxford give a talk about the impact of his work. And he said we did a book on hooliganism. In the 70s, we went and studied hooligans, and we described very, very well how they danced. We described hooliganism as a ritual that involved a great deal of dancing. And our book did very well. We all got good jobs. We got lots of citations, important research projects, lots of recognition. And people read our book. And some of the people who read our book were hooligans, and they thought dancing, we weren't meant to dance. And so they stopped dancing and they started killing one another. And every time I think about the impact of my work, this is the thought that comes to mind. Now, of course, Rome overestimated a bit the impact of his work. I can't accept that hooligans started killing each other because they read his book. There is a sort of, the causation is strange. But what I'm trying to say is that impact works really in strange ways. And so you need to have a conviction that what you are doing is good and is the right thing. And in such instances, engagement works and entrepreneurship works and methods work and so on. But if you don't, you can very easily find yourself in areas where this conviction can turn to its head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the unpredictable consequences of our research work, I think, is something to be aware of, but maybe not to be afraid of, because it's going to happen, I suppose, anyway, right? So, Anji, maybe you can share with us.
Sorry, can I add just one more word at least? Yes. I totally agree with them, Nikos. You need to be careful. But for example, only a few days ago, I think at the late May, the White House launched a blueprint for the use of social and behavioral sciences to advance evidence-based policy making. There is a kind of an acknowledgement that following probably COVID experience in general, that evidence-based policy, evidence will come from a wider variety of researchers, and actually having some regular experts or panels of experts, they regular feed in some specific details or typical topical evidence, depending on the type of policy we're addressing, could have some interesting result. Again, there's always the line between advising or decision making is two separate things. And to go back to what Alicia was saying, I mean, it's a little bit of division of labor. Some people are good at advising, some people are good at the sort of top level research, and they want to just sit in their lab, whatever lab we want to define. And some people are really very good communicators. They got the wider range of society they can get involved and engage. I don't think it is one type of research fits all. But having a system, a systemic support to policymakers of a wider range of research academics and people with a very deep knowledge of evidence to provide information to policymakers. It's systemic, so embedded into the system. For example, the European Commission got the scientific advisory mechanism, and go away from the single chief advisor, which is one single opinion, created this panel of scientists which are multidisciplinary. Will also help that concept of trust that you mentioned earlier in terms of exchange of views, and look at challenges from different perspectives with the individual knowledge. I can be a sociologist and look at a pen as a challenge and thinking about how bring a group together and talking, but you that could be a physics and think about the material in which a pen is designed. I'm just using a stupid sample, but looking at different perspective of a challenge from different type of experience is really important. And so this is embedded into a decision-making system in government. I think that could deliver interesting results and long-lasting.
Yeah, very clear, but very good point. Thank you, Gabby. Appreciate that. Joni, I see you have a hand up probably to respond to that, so go ahead and then we'll hand to Anji.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Gabby. I think that's brilliant. And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit here is the idea of building trust within the work that we do. But the other part of it is being trustworthy, and understanding that trust is something that that we always say we want to build. But being trustworthy is working within communities, working with patients, and actually seeing exactly what you're talking about, and how the science gets changed because it is multidisciplinary, and we are changing sort of the hierarchical structure to more of a flat structure in how we think about science and how we deliver science. And as we continue to do that and sort of rethink our own way of approaching it, that trustworthiness, I think, is something then that will be very much more important for the communities to be thinking about what they think of the science that is being delivered for public health, and understanding that it is trustworthy because of the more knowledge that goes into building the systems to accommodate that.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. The trust and the trustworthiness, I think, is a very important point. So, Joni, I would like to come back to talk about reproducibility and what advice we would give to research funders and policymakers about rigor and reproducibility, because no science is 100% bulletproof in terms of its accuracy, I suppose, right? So, Anji, please enlighten us on the human aspect and the collaborative aspect of working with academics.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, having been an academic myself, I think it's helped with working with academics. Touching on some of the points that was mentioned before, one of the questions, before answering your question, one of the questions that you asked was, have changes taken place to actually acknowledge collaboration and talking about research? There is a movement for that, and it is being introduced to policies for promotion. So basically, you mentioned the characters of a translational researcher. They are encouraged to actually engage with the public, engage with the patient population, but also talk about their science more. And it is where the metrics, some of the metrics for promotion criteria do encourage that, as well as speaking with the Technology Transfer Office to ensure that any of the fruits from their research can really turn into something tangible that will impact society. So there is a movement with regards to that. In answer to your last question with regards to collaborative working with researchers, researchers come in all shapes and sizes and different characters. Some can be very prickly. I think we mentioned trust before. This is a key part of it. And I think once you have that relationship with a researcher where you, as an innovation professional or even a funder, you realize that there are certain drivers that drive behavior, and an academic researcher publication is key. And we mentioned this before. It is where it's basically the currency to say, I am an expert in this field. But we know that translational research, to be impactful, you have to, if there's the possibility, you have to translate it and use the word, dare I, commercialize it to ensure, so it comes into something tangible that impacts society. The key to succeeding and working with an academic researcher is to really let them know and gain that trust and understanding that you are working with them, not against them. and it is a win-win situation. So you can have that publication, but you also can ensure that the outcomes from research can move forward and really turn into something that will impact that patient population. And no one's losing anything. No one's actually taking advantage of anyone. It does mean that timing is key, continuous communication. It is where the trust of the academic that they are not talking to someone who doesn't understand their science. It really is where you value them and they value you. It takes time to get that sort of relationship, but it happens all the time. I think as a funder, you carry a lot of weight and you can help and guide the behavior for translational researchers. A lot of it is making it possible so it's easy for them to do. And really the understanding and empathy with the drivers that they have and limitations that they have. Funding is scarce. So if you're going to support something, you know, the outcomes that you have and how you measure it, you make it so it aligns with research. So it's not a massive hurdle to report or to even conduct the research as the funder would like it to be conducted.
Okay, great insights. Thanks, Anji. If we have time, we're going to come back to the concept of bad actors, because translational science is collaborative science, right? And every person you collaborate with increases your chance of also ending up collaborating with somebody with whom you have deep regret that you did so. So if we have time, we'll come back to that. But I would like to spend a moment on reproducibility and rigor, especially when you're trying to feed policy. You need to be sure that you're feeding policy with good science. So what would your recommendations to policymakers and research funders be on how to minimize the risk of giving poor policy advice through faulty science? Anybody ready to take that? Please, Nikos, go ahead.
My first recipe is, before any advice is given, the scientists need to say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
You think that's an effective tool? Yeah, that would work. It really putting somebody
used in courts of justice for expert evidence. And what it does is that it makes the motive of the person giving the evidence part of the process. And that is extremely important for scientific evidence in policy and in any other form of decision making, but yet it's one simple step that we tend to ignore.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else? Please, Anji.
Yeah, we mentioned before collaborative working. One of the key things for research and the integrity of research, I think it's, as a funder, you can ensure that there's best practice. Interrogate the data. I mean, the thing is, as a funder, usually it's milestoned if it's translational research, and you are reporting on the progress of the research every so often. Ensure that there's a mechanism that you can dig deeper and ask those key questions and challenge like some of the data that's been put there. It's just don't take it as a given. But with regards to results and data feeding into policy, I don't think it should be just one channel and it shouldn't be just one individual. And we mentioned before collaborative working, but I think also meeting of the minds, so multiple minds feeding in and advising. You can't have just one person. I think it's coming from multiple perspectives. With translational research, it should be the key area. You should have that clinical approach coming in, the patient voice. I think everything should be feeding in to actually shape policy. It shouldn't just be one, for example, one leader in this area and that's it. So more roundtables, more collective approaches to actually feeding in and driving policy.
Brilliant, Anji, thank you. Alicia.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Anji's just said, and I think with everything we do, really that's the way to go forward, not just policy, but I 100% agree. But I think the other thing to think about is almost turn the question on its head, and it's the role of policymakers in being informed about the process of research, and our role as members of the R&D community to help that. So the relationship with policymakers, it shouldn't just be when you get some knowledge. It's about the relationship with the R&D community and the policy community, and having people that are informed on both sides. In the UK, and I'd be really interested to see what happens in other countries, we don't have enough movement of people in terms of their careers between academia and business. It's not as good as the US, for example, but also in policy. So, and that again goes back to the question of incentives. So academics are incentivized to stay in an academic career. If you leave academia, it's got massive implications on your future as an academic. So I think if we could get people moving around in roles, you've had a fuller understanding of those different environments so that you can make better decisions and have, like Anji described, have an understanding of why you need those sort of constructs to be better informed.
It's a good point, and also that experience also helps scientists really understand the vicissitudes of research at all its different phases. Research, yeah. The nature of it changes over time, and so I think that's very important. Having that cross-sectoral experience indeed is a very important point. Gabby.
Yeah, one thing that we can change slightly the question is a little campaign that I initiated a while ago here in Brussels, so with the European policymakers. They say, well, scientists have to cite their sources. Policy papers never cite what they refer their ideas to. Now, in terms of transparency, in terms of also accountability, not just the policymaker, but also the scientist cited, it's very interesting to have this kind of cross-reference. So, and it's also will work towards that concept of reward system you were mentioning at the beginning, Anton, because in some sort of way, if a policy paper and a policymaker is reading something that is changing completely his views, and is reading and he has been feedback by relevant expert, this expert is cited in their policymakers, so there's kind of accountability, and the researcher himself has a much bigger accountability because it's going to be public and transparent. So in some sort of way, is a mutual reinforcement of that. I think it would be brilliant. And so I keep asking the policymaker, why don't you cite your sources? Even if it's just your brilliant idea, why don't you put it down as your brilliant idea? But I think it would be great, and we'll give these two communities, particularly policymakers and scientists that are working together, a much better ground for developing and evolving in that level of trust and acknowledgement of each other contents, because sometimes practitioners play a major role in research and, for example, for policy policy piloting and policy experimentations and so on. So why not some citation in policy papers? It's something that we haven't done yet, but I think it should be really good.
I'm quite surprised, because the thing is, like, I do a lot of policy involvement and engagement, and I wouldn't be pleased to see something that's not cited. A lot of the time they do cite, but also it is where, and it's multiple sources. It's a lot of work to do it, but you have to, otherwise it's not really policy, it's someone's opinion. And it's really where that practice has to stop. It should be fact-based, but it should be taken into account all aspects, because you're not talking about just one individual or one group, you're talking about multiple groups. And policy feeds into the law, it falls into, practice. So it should really account for everything, and it should be based on fact rather than someone's opinion.
Indeed, very true. Joni, you have 20 seconds and then I have to wrap up, I'm afraid. You're on mute. Eating your time.
Perfect. 10 seconds would be fine. I was just going to add that, I think it would be great if we could help support as a community more fellowships that encourage some of this cross interaction, policy development, regulatory science development, and regulatory policy as well in the drug development pipeline. So thinking about this as a training opportunity, a growth opportunity, and fellowship opportunity, I think would be brilliant for all of us to consider.
Wonderful. And on that, I'm going to have to wrap it up here. And a huge thank you to yourselves. Very, very insightful discussion. We really hope that we were able to cross-fertilize across the different domains here. I really appreciate your time and your incentives, your insights. The hour and a half flew by. A big thank you to Lan Murdoch at Taylor & Francis for organizing this webinar, and of course the audience for sharing your questions. I really hope we can follow up with this in the future, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
See you.